from the Mexican-American War and Louisiana Purchase, America was doubling in size. As Americans pushed west, the issue of slavery came to a forefront. Would the new territories of the United States be slave, or would they be free? Because of the fertile soil in the southern parts of the United States, masses of cotton were grown there to make large amounts of profit. Plantation owners then needed cheap labor to harvest the cotton, and that's where slaves came in. Slaves were most commonly African Americans and used to work in the fields. They got no pay, hoard housing, and restricted their beliefs, heritage, and even their names. The 1846 Wilmot Proviso was an attempt to prevent slavery in the territories purchased from Mexico following the Mexican War. Named after its sponsor, Democratic Representative David Wilmot of Pennsylvania, the controversial Wilmot Proviso never did pass both houses of Congress, but it did ignite an intense national debate over slavery. Uncle Tom's Cabin was written by Harriet Beecher Stowe and told of the cruelty of slavery. It helped change the way many Northerners felt about slavery. Nat Turner was a religious slave who would see visions from God and believed he was born to free slaves. On a night with an eclipse, he made a decision to lead a slave rebellion. 75 slaves joined the rebellion. In the end, 50 whites were killed and 100 African Americans were killed. While the Northern economy was based on factory work from the Industrial Revolution time period, the Southern economy was mostly based off of agriculture or farming. Also, when the federal government wished to raise tariffs, the Northern congressmen generally supported it, but the Southern congressmen generally opposed these ideas. The majority of the South believed in slavery because it was what they thought was needed in order to sustain a strong economy. The majority of the North did not support this idea of owning slaves like the South. The friction of the social views was a main source of conflict that later led to the American Civil War. The Southerners were supporters of Douglas's popular sovereignty, or letting states decide for themselves on the issue of slavery. Much of the North was against popular sovereignty and believed that the federal government was best fit to make all decisions regarding highly controversial issues, such as slavery. South Carolina called a state convention that nullified the tariffs of 1828 and 1832 within their borders and threatened to secede if the federal government attempted to collect those tariff duties. President Andrew Jackson immediately offered his thought that the nullification was tantamount to treason and quickly dispatched ships to Charleston Harbor and began strengthening federal fortifications there. When Missouri applied to the Union as a slave state in 1819, the balance of slave and free was at an upset. Without Missouri, there were 11 free states and 11 slave states. There was much controversy over this until Maine applied as a state in 1820, where Maine was declared a free state, Missouri a slave state, and the two sides equal. For now. California wanted to be admitted to the Union as a free state. This would make it so that there would be more free states and fewer slave states. The South was against this, and another compromise was to be made. The 5 acts of this bill were: California was admitted to the Union as a free state. The New Mexico and Utah territories were to decide on the slavery question by relying on popular sovereignty. Texas lost the New Mexico territory, but received $10 million from the federal government for its loss. the slave trade in the District of Columbia was abolished. A new Fugitive Slave Act was passed. The Fugitive Slave Law required that all citizens were obligated to return runaway slaves. People who helped slaves escape would be jailed and fined. The law enraged Northerners because it made them feel a part of the slave system. Persons involved with the Underground Railroad worked to subvert the law. In 1854, Stephen Douglas introduced a bill to help solve the problem of slavery in the new Nebraska Territory. He proposed that Nebraska be divided into two territories, Kansas and Nebraska. The settlers of these territories would decide whether they would like to be slave or free. This proposal set off a storm of controversy because it effectively undid the Missouri Compromise. The act set off bitter violence in the Kansas Territory when anti- and pro-slavery forces set up rival governments. The area became known as Bleeding Kansas. Former slave Dred Scott first went to trial to sue for his freedom in 1847. 10 years later, his case was finally brought before the United States Supreme Court. The court decided that all people of African ancestry, slaves as well as those who were free, could never become citizens of the United States and therefore could not sue in federal court. In October of 1859, abolitionist John Brown led 21 men on a raid of the federal arsenal at Harper's Ferry, Virginia. His plan to arm slaves with the weapons from the arsenal was thwarted by Marines led by Robert E. Lee. Within 36 hours of the attack, most of Brown's men had been killed. The Lincoln-Douglas debate was a debate between Republican Abe Lincoln and Northern Democrat Stephen Douglas for the Illinois State Senate. In it, there was a series of cross-examination questions and rebuttals that heated up the debate. Douglas, who wrote the Kansas-Nebraska Act, ended up with the Illinois Senate seat. Two years later, in 1860, Lincoln and Douglas were running against each other again, now for the presidency, along with John Breckinridge of the Southern Democratic Party and John Bell of the Constitutional Union Party. This time, Lincoln won with his idea to abolish slavery, which was the last straw for many slave states. In 1860, South Carolina seceded from the Union, followed by Alabama, Florida, Texas, Georgia, Louisiana, and Mississippi. In 1861, the 7 states held a convention in Montgomery, Alabama, the original capital, and formed the Confederate States of America.
Sergeant Pepper's Production